In the crime-ridden streets of 18th century London, things were happening to change the way criminals used the landscape to their advantage. As the law was more of a suggestion than a rule, thieves, housebreakers and con artists didn't just lurk in the shadows, they ran the streets. And one man didn't just survive in this underworld, he thrived. After racking up debts he couldn't pay, a once ordinary household servant found himself chucked into prison with no way out. But rather than rotting away behind bars, he saw an opportunity. With a bit of charm and a lot of cunning, he wormed his way into the good books of the very people keeping him locked up, and before long they were letting him slip out into the night, with the proviso that he'd be bringing in more criminals, helping them keep their dodgy prison empire ticking over. But little did they realise he wasn't just playing their game. He was slowly making his way to the top, and soon he would rule over a criminal empire where he decided who would walk free and who would be sent to the gallows, playing judge, jury and executioner all rolled into one. But as we all know, there's only so long dodgy dealings can go unpunished, and someone was waiting in the wings, ready to expose his sordid empire, sending him to the very fate he'd dealt out so many times before. But would he make it there, or take the job into his own hands? Today on Macabre London, we uncover the rise and fall of Jonathan Wild, the self-proclaimed thief-taker general who learned the hard way that crime really does pay, until it doesn't. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. Welcome back to this second part of the story for Jonathan Wild, the scandalous thief-taker of London. If you've yet to listen to part 1, make sure you do that first so you'll get all the context you need before you embark on this second leg of the tale. Over the course of 2025, I'm going to be having a thread of policing in London to tie things together. But these are the first 2 in that series, then we'll have a macabre mini-mystery to break things up, another case, and then we'll pick up with some more policing stories. What I've been researching so far has been so interesting, and I think it really helps to give a balanced view of crime in the capital city. So I hope you'll subscribe, follow, and do all of those things if you aren't already to keep up with the series. If you want to get more of the show, then I'd love for you to join me on Patreon. The lowest tiers on there get access to the exclusive Patreon-only podcast and my audiobook readings. So if you want more, that's where you'll get it. And thanks for considering it. It really makes a difference and helps to bring me one step closer to doing this full time, which is my dream. But now it's time to grab your lantern and wrap up warm as we're about to embark onto the cold, cobbled streets of London in the 1700s to go and track down John Wild and see what he's been up to. In the early 1700s, criminality as a profession was on the rise. The influx of people moving to the capital and the increase in the production of goods and wealth meant that there was a new job prospect for those who wanted to make money without putting in months of hard graft for little payoff. As property owners increased and more buildings popped up in London, this meant breaking and entering and burglary became more prevalent. Pickpockets stalked every street and infiltrated crowded places, particularly Covent Garden and the surrounding areas, places where the well-to-do and the not-so-well-to-do rubbed shoulders, amongst other things. The areas around Soho and Covent Garden were controlled by rival gangs, and to complicate matters, these rival gangs would sometimes work together harmoniously at an arm's length, but when they made the mistake of crossing over each other's boundary lines or started affecting each other's livelihoods, then things would quickly turn sour. The two most prevalent crime lords disguised as knights in shining armour during this time were Jonathan Wild and Charles Hitchin. Charles was a long-term career criminal who'd started off as a thief, but soon worked out there was plenty of money to be made in turning his fellow criminals in, so he became what was known as a thief-taker, someone who made citizens' arrests and then surrendered the criminal for a handsome reward, which in today's money would equate to several £1,000s. This lucrative but dangerous job was open to plenty of corruption, but if you were savvy enough to outwit the criminals you were trying to capture, then you really could make crime pay. This is where our next anti-hero learned his craft, on the cold, mean streets of the West End. Jonathan Wild was a bucklemaker from Wolverhampton who decided he'd rather go and seek better prospects in London after a few failed attempts at being a servant. He fell into debt and wound up in a debtor's prison where he fell in with, depending how you look at it, the wrong crowd or perhaps the right one. He was lucky enough to have attended school back in Wolverhampton. He was unlike most of his other criminal inmates who were basically in prison as a scam. Debtors were charged to be in prison, which kept those that owned the jails with a never-ending supply of income, as the incarcerated had no money, so they would use them as free labour and even made them beg passers-by for money. However, being smarter than your average bear, Jonathan soon worked his way around the system, made friends with the guards who realised he was as conniving as they were, and so they allowed him to regularly leave prison to carry out errands. Jonathan would always return and eventually earned so much trust from the guards that he was allowed to bring new prisoners to the jail in return for payment from his captors. This allowed him to build up enough money to start a money-lending racket for his fellow inmates, which saw him being able to raise a reasonable sum of cash, one which was close to letting him pay off his debts altogether. But in 1712, a new Act of Parliament was introduced, which shut down the immoral practice of debtors' prisons, and so Jonathan was free. He moved in with his girlfriend, Mary Milliner, a West End sex worker, and eventually a madam and brothel owner herself. The pair decided they would now be married, even though both of them were still married to their previous but long estranged significant others. Jonathan would later fall out with Mary, and she would throw him out on his ear, which is ironic because he actually cut one of hers off after the argument, leaving her with a permanent reminder of him. Jonathan went on to set up a regular grift as a fence, which basically meant he was the mediator in dealing in stolen goods, which wasn't a crime back then, but he would also use this operation to capture criminals that he thought were competition, and that meant that if you were a criminal in the Covent Garden area, you couldn't be without him, but he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. After setting up a reliable gang of thieves, he carried out grifting for a number of years. But Charles Hitchin was always keeping an eye on him. Charles admired Wild's skill, and after Hitchin bought himself the position as the under-marshal of the city, basically the head of law enforcement before there was such a thing, he brought Jonathan in as his right-hand man, and even entrusted him with looking after things after he himself was investigated for blatant corruption. When Charles returned to his role after his short year-long break, Jonathan wasn't keen to just hand over the reins, so things were fraught between the two, eventually ending up in a duel of publishing pamphlets to the general population to explain just how wicked both of them really were, a true public slanging match. As Charles was actually a closeted gay man, a hangable offence back in the 1700s, the homophobic public sided with Jonathan, and Charles was sacked. But it wouldn't take long for the public to grow suspicious of Jonathan too. As he became complacent within his now self-appointed role as chief thief-taker of London and Ireland, he had arrested and sent a lot of innocent people to the gallows. In fact, it's suspected that over 70 people died as a result of Jonathan capturing them and turning them in to the authorities. He'd also convinced the Privy Council to up his wages per thief turned in from £40 about £7,000 in today's money, to around £140 per capture, about 25k today. So it's safe to say he was rolling in cash from the death of others, a cutthroat business if ever there was one. Jonathan had started also publicly blackmailing people via the newspapers, getting his thieves to steal from gentlemen's clothing whilst they were at brothels, and then threatening to reveal their details in the paper if they didn't pay up. These tactics didn't seem fair to the general public, and so they started to turn against him. And that's where we pick our story back up today, with Jonathan slipping from the public's favour, about to encounter a thief that would really give him a run for his money. As John had been trying to secure a higher position within polite society, but because of his tendency to not be the nicest of people, he was often shunned. But of course, the people at the top still wanted him to do the work of clearing up criminals, or basically making sure the poor were picked off bit by bit. It was effectively murder for hire, so they tolerated him. But with the repetitive rejection from those above him, John began asking for more and more. Being constantly rebuffed was making him mad. He demanded the freedom of the city, aka the ability to be in charge of all the city's law enforcement, but he was told he couldn't have it. Jonathan was now also getting flack from those under him as well. With his thousands of pounds earned as thief-taker, he'd also bought many properties and was renting them out to tenants that he'd bully for more rent, and extorted them and threatened them until they paid up. He'd also begun trading stolen goods overseas, hiring boats and sending stuff away to be sold abroad. But again, he'd often refuse to pay those involved, and if anyone threatened to say anything, off to Tyburn they went. But if you were able to stay on his good side, Jonathan was actually quite good at paying out handsomely to those who did as they were told. And so those who survived off his backhanders weren't willing to reveal what was really going on behind the scenes. As he grew crueler and more calculated, and the authorities realised that even though Jonathan was doing quite a lot to eliminate crime, he was also creating a lot of it too, and he was keeping it going. Jonathan had been training a lot of his thieves to integrate with high society, as after all, that's where the money was. He would have his ladies of the evening learn court dances and bought them fine gowns so they could go and charm men at high society balls. And then whilst they were there, they'd flirt with men, canoodle with them, and then they'd take their jewellery, brooches and pocket watches. The male thieves would also work their way through the crowds and pick pockets, or also woo the women and do the exact same. So now Wilde's merry band were biting the hand that fed them, which had turned a blind eye to his practices before. This infiltration didn't go unnoticed, and when it happened a few times over, people realised this may well have something to do with the chief thief-taker himself. As Wilde's band of thieves started to revolt against him and began keeping the loot, the faith in his abilities by both his gang and those he served was beginning to run out. At the same time, the practice of thief-taking was being questioned by the general public at large, as a new thief had captured everyone's hearts. Jack Sheppard, a burglar, had been apprehended by one of Jonathan's thief-takers and put in prison. Jack had once been one of Jonathan's gang, but as Jack didn't want to eventually go the way of many of his criminal friends, he decided to break free of Wilde's control. However, anyone that decided to leave usually made them more of a target, as they had insider knowledge, and so Jack was a target for Wilde and his gang. After being caught and imprisoned, Jack knew he was a sitting duck, and it wouldn't be long before Wilde would have him executed, so he managed to break out of prison in just 3 short hours. A month later, Jack was caught again and once more put behind bars in a different prison. His girlfriend, Elizabeth Lyon, who also went by the much cooler name of Edgeworth Bess, stopped by the following day to visit, and she too was arrested and thrown in with Jack. They were both then moved to another prison, and just 6 days later, they managed to both break out. In July, Wilde was mad that Jack had now broken out twice, and so he asked one of his gang to bring Edgeworth Bess to a nearby tavern where he chatted to her. Unbeknownst to her who this man was, he plied her with plenty of drinks until she ratted out Jack, revealing where he was. The following day, Jonathan sent a thief-taker to arrest Jack, and this time made sure he was put somewhere he couldn't escape from, the horrendous and putrid Newgate prison. About 3 weeks later, Jack was put on trial and found guilty of 1 count of burglary. Originally, Wilde had tried to get him on 2 other accounts too, but the jury didn't find him guilty of those as the evidence presented wasn't sufficient enough to convince them of his guilt. However, just 1 guilty verdict was enough to send Sheppard to the gallows, and Wilde was content justice had been served. He'd get a nice payout, and the scamp everyone had come to adore would be no more. But Jack wasn't going to go quietly, and once more he managed to get out of the oppressive confines of Newgate. The inherent problem with Newgate Prison was that it allowed the general public to visit, and as Jack was well liked due to his cheeky, non-violent crime, it meant people didn't want to see him hang, and his accomplices and friends knew they could smuggle in and give him the equipment he needed to escape. After all, Edgeworth Bess was waiting for him on the outside, and everyone wanted to see them reunited. He seemingly had forgiven her for ratting him out, but you really can't blame her when Jonathan plied her with so much drink. Jack went on the run for 9 days and managed to evade capture once more by Wilde's thief-takers, but eventually he was found hiding on Finchley Common by Newgate's warders, who carried him back to the prison. This time he was definitely not to get out under threat from Jonathan, that the Newgate jailers would be in serious trouble if he did. So Jack was locked inside the most secure room the prison had and was wrapped in heavy chains which were bolted into the floor, and he was placed in shackles. A month went past and it seemed the restriction of Jack had worked as he was still in prison, but on the outside things weren't going so well for Jonathan. Not content with just taking Jack down, he wanted to pick off other members of his gang, so he went after his best friend, notorious highwayman, Blueskin. Blueskin, whose real name was Joseph Blake, was a long-time accomplice of Jack's, but had broken off to become a highwayman and was very successful at it, becoming one of the most terrifying and threatening figures toward polite society, but another working-class hero for those who were downtrodden. Blueskin was arrested by Jonathan's gang, and Wilde went to court to present evidence that he was guilty of the same crimes that Jack was, as he had been an accomplice at the burglary he was found guilty of. The jury agreed, and Blueskin was found guilty and sentenced to death. The death sentence felt particularly harsh, seeing as at one point Blueskin and Jonathan had actually been friends and accomplices themselves, but both Sheppard and Blake had left Wilde's gang at around the same time, and it seemed this was now very personal to Jonathan, who wanted to see them both dead. Blueskin was of course distraught at his sentencing and pleaded in the courtroom with Wilde that he should convince the judge that he should be transported instead of killed. Wilde refused to say anything, quietly smug that he'd won, and so Blueskin flung himself across the courtroom like a thing possessed and drew a pocket knife and frantically stabbed at Jonathan's neck. He made contact and gouged his throat before being dragged off Wilde, and this only hastened the death sentence he was so desperately trying to avoid. Jonathan was in a critical condition. He collapsed and had to be carried to a doctor for instant medical attention. Meanwhile, as this had all happened within the confines of Newgate Prison itself, the hysteria spread throughout the residence, and there was someone in there who could use this to their advantage. Once more, Jack Sheppard seized the opportunity of his guards disappearing to deal with the disturbance and somehow managed to get out of his restraints and break through the iron-barred door. How he did this, nobody knows, but once again, he was free. After a fortnight on the run, eventually Jack was caught and returned to Newgate. This time, he wasn't kept on his own. He was put in the centre of a room, which was surrounded by guards. Chained to the floor, his chains were given additional weights to stop him being able to stand, and he became a macabre tourist attraction for the wealthy who wanted to come and visit him. He was also allowed to be taken out of his restraints, but put in a separate private locked room along with the artist James Thornhill, who created a painting of him, a privilege only usually reserved for the very rich. But here he was, a lowly prisoner, who was so extraordinary he was deemed worthy of memorialising. But unfortunately, the time had come though for Blueskin and Jack to be finally sent to their death, with Blueskin being sent to the Tyburn Triple Tree just 6 short days before Jack would arrive at Tyburn as well on the 16th of November 1724. Jack's final journey, whilst on the Tyburn cart, was attended by a quarter of the city's population, as over 200,000 people lined the streets around Oxford Circus and Holborn as the cart passed through. The security to make sure the cart wasn't ambushed was significant. Armed guards rode alongside, keeping Jack protectively cocooned from any would-be rescuers. Before Jack was loaded onto the cart, his chains and shackles were removed and his hands tied in front of him. Suspecting that the master escape artist might try and make one last bid for freedom, they checked him over and found a pocket knife stashed in his breeches, which was quickly confiscated. With Jack loaded onto the cart, the final stop was for a drink to steady his nerves. At the Oxford Tavern, Jack was presented with a pint of sherry, which he knocked back, and soon he was feeling warm and woozy. Now, in an interesting marketing ploy, there had been an official autobiography produced of the gentleman thief's life, which he'd recounted to the author, John Appleby, whilst behind bars. As Jack was being wheeled up to the Triple Tree at Tyburn, there were people selling copies of the pamphlet, and so you could see Jack's execution, go home with the souvenir guide. Jack didn't actually mind though. Giddy from the booze, more than likely in disbelief about what was going to happen to him, his final act was to hand a copy of the pamphlet to a lucky person in the crowd. Jack was also well aware that his execution was a turning point for the criminal justice system, and that he was safe in the knowledge that his autobiography would expose some of the worst criminal masterminds in the whole of London, namely Jonathan Wild. So he was about to have the last laugh. A few moments later, the noose was placed around Jack's neck and the horses given the signal to trot on. Jack was hoisted into the air, but he still had one last trick up his sleeve. As he was so small, thin and slight, he knew that there could be a fighting chance that if he was rescued and cut down in time, he could be revived. Having tasked his friends with doing so, they tried desperately to get through the crowd, but well-meaning onlookers were deliberately blocking people from getting to the corpse as they didn't want Jack to be taken for medical dissection, a fate deemed worse than death back then, as the belief was that it didn't allow the person to cross over into heaven. This, however, was not the plan, and it meant that Jack ended up being on the gallows for over 15 minutes. And when he was cut down, he was most definitely deceased, having died a slow, painful death. When his body was cut down, it was seized by the crowd, and he was quickly removed to be buried in the churchyard at St Martin in the Fields, his grave protected by guards until his body had decayed enough that he wouldn't be dug back up by body snatchers or trophy hunters. Jonathan Wild couldn't attend the execution as he was still recovering from his attempted murder by Blueskin. However, as he began to recover, it was obvious that things were changing. What with both Jack Sheppard and Blueskin having gone to an early grave and the tell-all autobiography being out there for everyone to read, it showed the general public that things were way more corrupt than they'd originally thought. And as the ever-increasing wealth gap was highlighting, anyone who held a position of power which was accompanied by an uncontrollable amount of wealth meant they couldn't be trusted to not abuse that privilege. And soon everything began to unravel, and ironically, the thing that would finally bring Wild down would be the theft of a piece of lace. Both the parish of Westminster and the city were both after Wild, and so they bribed and coerced as many of his fellow criminals to shop in their boss. Knowing his days were numbered, many of Wilde's gang provided evidence or implicated him in several crimes, exposed his bribery and corruption scams, and made sure there was a list of crimes as long as his arm. The theft of a piece of lace, which was then returned to an owner, was identified as having belonged to a neighbour of Wilde's, and with a positive identification of the man who returned it to them and the thief who had been identified as having known Wilde, the jig was up. When Jonathan was captured, he gave an impassioned plea to his captors and those in the surrounding area to try and put forward his side of the story, saying, "I wonder, good people, what it is you would see. I'm a poor honest man who have done all I could to serve people when they have had the misfortune to lose their goods by the villainy of thieves. I've contributed more than any man living to bringing the most daring and notorious malefactors to justice. Yet now, by the malice of my enemies, you see I am in custody and am going before a magistrate who I hope will do me justice." In 1725, everything came crumbling down. And just like the dozens of people he'd sent to the Tyburn Tree, Jonathan Wilde was set to join them. All that was needed was one small crime, which he was found guilty of, and so he was subsequently given the death sentence, seemingly just over the cost of a £10 piece of lace, when in fact it was really for the decade of corruption, needless deaths, and the criminal underworld he'd helped to create and keep afloat the whole time. Now it was time for payback. Not wanting to face the public humiliation and violent death he would have to go through at the gallows, Jonathan decided to take matters into his own hands. He retired to his bed the day before his execution and drank enough laudanum to put him into a coma, but not enough to send him to an early grave. The following day, his unconscious body was loaded onto the cart headed for Tyburn anyway, and people jeered and threw stones at his still body along the way, and he was still strung up in front of everyone and executed as the public, and more importantly his enemies, wanted to see him hang. After he was executed, his new girlfriend did manage to retrieve his body, and she paid the jailers at Newgate to bury it in a secret grave. But just as Jonathan himself would have more than likely done, they betrayed her and received a payment from a doctor who allowed his resurrectionists to dig up his body. After he'd been dissected, his bones were stripped and donated to the Royal College of Surgeons, and in time put on display at the Hunterian Museum. Now, the Hunterian Museum did undergo a refurbishment, and I've not yet had a chance to go see the new version of the museum, so I'm not sure if he's still there, but I will go soon, and if he is there, I'll be sure to let you know via my social media. So keep an eye on my account at Nikki Macabre London on Instagram and at Macabre London on TikTok. So with the criminal underworld now not policing itself and the job of thief-taker being a despised one, this meant that the next chapter of law enforcement was about to begin. But I think we'll save that for another episode when we continue on with the history of policing London, so make sure you're subscribed or following to keep up with the series. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Macabre London. I hope you enjoyed that two-parter. This year I'll be covering the history of policing in London, and to make sure I've got enough time to research and make sure these episodes are as good as they can be, I'll be having this as a recurring theme throughout the year. So if you're hooked already, you'll want to stick around for the next ones as and when they're available. There'll be a little macabre mini mystery coming up to punctuate this little policing chapter. Then the next full-length episode coming up is a very twisty-turny one, as we're putting the policing on hold and instead heading into a mystery which baffled the residents of South London in a case that spanned a few years. Here's a hint, it's a family murder mystery which is as perplexing as it is shocking, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. If you want to help me create this content, it's as easy as throwing a few quid my way on Patreon. All donations help me to keep up with my costs like newspaper archive subscriptions, books I need to buy for research, and also the odd coffee to keep me going whilst I write. So if you're able to and would like bonus extra content in return, such as my bonus podcast, which you can only get on Patreon, called Having a Problem, and my spooky bedtime stories, then make sure you sign up now. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry and Veronica, and all of our fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from the city's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.